So in a few minutes, we will start the talk with Bill, and then there will be a discussion with Q&A, and there will be some time for a few audience questions. Your questions will be accepted electronically through an app called Slido. I think it's called Slido or Slido. I don't really know. Here it is. And what you need to do, if you haven't already, is connect to our Wi-Fi. The network is SFAI Friends. Our password is highly secure. It's called SFAI, all lowercase. And so get on the Wi-Fi, and once you do, point your camera at this QR code. And that'll take you directly to the app where you can type in your questions and hit submit. If for some reason the QR code isn't working, you can log on to slido.com and input the number shown here, 827-8952. Looks like many of you have already done that and you've got your questions ready to go. So as you are getting logged in, let's welcome Johanna Gilligan, Chief External Affairs Officer at HomeWise, to get the talk started. Yes.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you for having us here tonight. It's such a pleasure to spend this evening with you all, and we're so really very lucky to have Bill McKibben with us tonight to close out this 6-month Livability Speaker Series. I think Jamie gave a great background for why we have done this, but I did want to just give a quick recap on what the speaker series has been. So realizing that land use entitlements meetings were not the best place to have good values and vision discussion about land use, we thought, let's start a series that helps connect the dots between land use and affordability and land use and sustainability. So we kicked this off with 3 sessions on the ways that land use is connected to how affordable or not housing is. We began with a powerful call to action from Matthew Desmond, who reminded us that our values cannot end at our property lines, and we must embrace higher density and affordable housing if we want a city for everyone. We learned from inclusionary zoning expert Rick Jacobus that we need both requirements and incentives, including subsidy, like the 3% tax, for a market to deliver enough affordable housing. And then we got a chance to see several local and one national example of what affordable housing looks like. An inspiring reminder that we have dynamic, creative, and dedicated Santa Feans working hard every day to create communities for those being pushed out of this expensive housing market. The latter half of the series has been connecting the dots between land use and sustainability. In September, Congresswoman Stansberry, Santa Fe Water Division Director Jesse Roach, and State Water Planning Manager Andrew Erdman told us our own success story of increased water conservation in Santa Fe. Turns out that today we use 33% less water with 25% more population than 1995. Yeah, it is something to be really proud of. And although it's clear we have very significant climate challenges ahead, this summer is obviously a bracing intro to what is to come. It was a good reminder that we also have a track record of working together to thoughtfully manage our precious resources. And then earlier this month, we got the chance to delve into the critical issue of parking with Henry Gravatt, who shocked us with the stat that there are roughly 4 to 9 parking spaces for every single vehicle, which is basically 2 billion parking spaces in America. Henry asked us what more we could do with this space than hold it for car storage. By the way, these talks are all recorded and posted on our website, so I'd encourage you to check them out if you have not been able to attend them in person. And tonight, an amazing end to such a dynamic series, we get to hear from Bill McKibben, one of the world's leading environmentalists, and the very, very first person to write a book predicting the conundrum we are all now in with climate change. Before I properly introduce Bill, I would like to once more call out the collective efforts that have brought this series to life. HomeWise teamed up with a group of housing, design, and sustainability organizations to design and launch this program, and I just want to quickly acknowledge them all. The Santa Fe Housing Action Coalition, Mass Design Group, Women's International Studies Center, Friends of Architecture Santa Fe, Urban Land Institute, Santa Fe Chamber of Commerce, LifeLink, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, the City of Santa Fe's Office of Affordable Housing, and of course, our partner in this event this evening, the Santa Fe Art Institute. Let's give it up for doing this together. to introduce Bill McKibben. You know, the old saying, this is a man that needs no introduction, it's cheesy, but it's very true. Bill is a contributing writer to The New Yorker and a founder of Third Act, which organizes people over the age of 60 to work on climate and racial justice. He founded the first global grassroots climate campaign, 350.org, and serves as the Schumann Distinguished Professor in Residence at Middlebury College in Vermont. In 2014, he was awarded the Right Livelihood Prize, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel, in the Swedish Parliament. He's also won the Gandhi Peace Award and honorary degrees from 19 colleges and universities. He has written over a dozen books about the environment, including his first, The End of Nature, published in 1989. And his latest book is The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon. A graying American looks back at his suburban boyhood and wonders, what the hell happened? Let's welcome Bill.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for having me here. I've really been enjoying myself. And I got to speak briefly at the graduation last night of the new fellows. I think some of them are here tonight. Yes, what a pleasure that was. And I'm very glad about this because it means that if I bore you, you can occupy yourselves trying to get on whatever app this is. So whatever your amusement is. But I want to show a different slide to explain why I am here tonight. Do we have that other slide? Thank you very much. I agreed to come to Santa Fe in part because I was admiring the work they were doing, but in part because I owe a debt to this particular place, the Art Institute, and I believe in repaying debts when I can. 10 or 15 years ago, we organized one at 350.org, what we called the biggest art project that anybody had ever done, because we needed satellites to capture the images of these vast installations we were making with thousands and tens of thousands of people around the planet. And there were some very beautiful ones in Egypt and the Dominican Republic and Iceland and on and on and on. But the most beautiful, and the one that I've shown 1,000 times to audiences across the world, was this picture that organized by people here at the Santa Fe Art Institute who got hundreds or thousands of Santa Feans with blue blankets and towels and things, and when the satellite come over, they held them up overhead, and for a minute that dry riverbed turned back into a living river for a moment, and a kind of reminder of where we are and what we're up to. And that was 13 years ago, and since then we've added another 30 parts per million of CO2 to the atmosphere. For me, this timeline goes back further, as Johanna said, to 1989, when I wrote the first book about what we then called the greenhouse effect, a book called The End of Nature. It was a warning. It was an attempt to amplify the earliest warnings that were coming from scientists. And those warnings were extremely accurate and prescient. Our civilization got a heads up about what was going to happen, a clear warning about what we needed to do, and what would happen if we didn't heed those warnings. We didn't heed those warnings, and so that thing has happened now, or at least begun to in very large ways. I think that 2023 was the year that I was writing about back in 1989. The year that we finally would see in all its glory what climate change looks like in its early stages. And you have seen the images from all around the world this year. I won't bother repeating them at great length, but Canada has seen forest fires on a scale the world's never witnessed before. Those fires have produced more carbon than everybody in Canada doing all the cooking and flying and heating and cooling and driving they've done. It's a third as much of the carbon that those fires have poured into the air. They're not going to go out until there's deep snow around. You've seen the pictures of flooding from every corner of the planet. In Vermont, where I live, we had more rain than we've ever had, and it was really traumatic and difficult, but nothing like what happened in Libya last month, where they had the biggest rainstorm in their history, and it washed out 2 dams and then washed 10,000 people out to sea where they drowned in an hour. You may have seen the images last night and the night before from Acapulco. Just the first time that a Category 5, the eye wall of a Category 5 hurricane has ever hit a city that large, about 1 million people. And the pictures that are beginning to finally filter out today are almost unbelievable when you see them, just giant buildings shredded. I don't even want you to think about the pictures for a minute. I want you just to think about the basic number here. This is the hottest year we've ever recorded on this planet, and by a very large margin. Those direct records go back a couple hundred years, because that's how long we've had thermometers. But scientists are good at extending that record with ice cores and lake sediments and things. Everybody's completely confident that we have lived through in 2023 the hottest year in at least 125,000 years. That is, no human society that we would recognize has ever dealt with a climate the kind that we're dealing with now. And we're still nearer the beginning than the end of this rise in temperature, unless we get things under control very fast. The system of this planet is starting to shudder. The jet stream and the Gulf Stream are now behaving in odd and dangerous ways. The planet, yes, will be here. There's always going to be a big rock 3 out from the sun and so on. But the planet, as humans have known it in any event, is not going to be here in ways that we recognize unless we get our act together very quickly. And I say that in this context as a way to get at this topic that they've asked me to address tonight, this topic of the need to start building stuff fast on this planet. It's not the only thing that we need to do. Dealing with climate change is essentially a 2-part problem. The first part of that problem is to stop doing bad things, mostly the burning of fossil fuel. And I've spent much of my life doing that, and I'm happy for it. I got to help lead in the fight to block the Keystone Pipeline, which was one of the few big successes that we have. I know many people in here helped with that. And we've built the biggest anti-corporate campaign in this divestment campaign from fossil fuel, which is now at about $40 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have sold their stock and poured oil and gas. And I've spent the last few weeks hard at work on the project of trying to stop new approvals for the export of gas from the U.S. abroad. That gas is coming from the Permian Basin in New Mexico, and it's being shipped around the world. And the quantities are astonishing. If this gas build-out continues at the pace that they're planning, by 2030, exported American gas will produce more greenhouse gas emissions than everything that happens in the European Union. So the scale is tremendous, and there's enormous work to be done. But I'm not going to talk about that tonight much. What I want to talk about tonight is the other half of the equation, which is the things that we have to do to replace that power in a world that uses a lot of it. And we know now how to do that. Scientists gave us a great gift with this warning 35 years ago. And engineers have given us an extraordinary gift by figuring out how to make use basically of the power of the sun to do what we need to do. They've dropped the price of renewable energy 90% in the last decade. We now live on a planet where the cheapest way to produce power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That is a water into wine miracle of the highest order. And if we were able to take full advantage of it, if we moved quickly and globally, then it means there's really no technological or financial obstacle to starting to catch up with the physics of climate change. And it's beginning to happen. Beginning really to happen, to take off in this same year, 2023, that the climate is coming completely unglued. As of this summer, at the same moment that the scientists, the same week that my old friend Jim Hansen, the greatest of all climate scientists, called to tell me that the temperature was as high as it had been in 125,000 years, another friend of mine called to tell me said, look, we've got the new data. The Earth at the moment is installing a gigawatt worth of solar power every day. That's a nuclear power plant's worth of solar power every day. Most of that's going in China, about half of it. But that's still a fair amount in the rest of the world. We're finally beginning to at least glimpse what the pace might look like that we need to be on. But the time is very, very short in this case. Global warming is a timed test. If we don't solve it soon, we do not solve it, because nobody has a plan for how to freeze the Arctic again once we melt it, say. So the IPCC, the scientific authorities, have told us that we need, by 2030, to have cut emissions in half. 2030, by my watch, is 6 years away. That means we have a hell of a lot of work to do. And a lot of that work involves building more stuff. It involves putting up those solar panels and those wind turbines and the batteries to store that power when the sun goes down or the wind drops. It will be a project without, with very few historical antecedents to its size. Perhaps the only one was the effort in the very first, in the middle of the last century, over a few years' time in this country, to build the armaments to defeat fascism in Europe in the last century. And that's the only sort of industrial project on this scale, but in this case it has to happen globally. Happily, in this case, we're building not the weapons of war, but the weapons of sustainable life for people everywhere. There are many, many challenges to doing this, just pure physical challenges of figuring out how you assemble all the stuff and whatever. The challenge that I'm mostly going to talk about tonight is the challenge that comes because it's very easy, especially in our society, to block new things. Okay? And what I'm going to suggest tonight are just a few reasons why people might not want to go hire a lawyer to block something that they might be able to block. Okay? And I am speaking here mostly to people like me, old white guys who are good at blocking stuff. You know? I have no wish to tell indigenous communities what to do. I understand why they might well decide they wanted to opt out of this next industrial project and so on and so forth. But I'm talking to people like me. To give you an idea of the arguments that are sort of, I'm going to get to what I think the real argument is that people use, but to give an idea of the kind of arguments that we use to cover the real reasons for our opposition, let's just list them and talk about them briefly. Maybe the most powerful one that I hear often from people is, well, instead of doing this, let's change our ways of life and use a lot less energy so we don't have to go build all these solar panels. I completely believe in that, and I've spent much of my life working on those things. I built the first campaign. I'm a writer. That's the only craft or skill I actually have, but I've sort of making it up as I go along as a volunteer activist for the last 20 years, 25 years. I've tried lots of things. One of them, for example, was the first big campaign against SUVs, because they're an obnoxious and completely, I remember a time, because I'm old, when it was possible for humans to move their possessions and their bodies through space without the need for a kind of semi-military vehicle to accomplish this. We ran big campaigns that got lots of press and attention, involving lots and lots of people, including, say, evangelical Christians. We had this big "What Would Jesus Drive" campaign. And you know what? It didn't really work. The size of American cars have just kept getting bigger and bigger. I do think that this is a cultural project that will eventually work, because consumer capitalism's fatal flaw is that it doesn't make us as happy as it says it does. But I also think that that's not going to happen in 6 years. And I think that if you think it is, then you're being wildly unrealistic. And I don't think that climate change in its brute threat allows us to be unrealistic in those ways. People point out that solar and wind are dirty energy too, in certain ways, and they are. Every intervention that we make on this planet causes trouble, and you can go and see spectacular examples of it in cobalt mines in the Congo, or so on and so forth. And we have to work hard, and happily I think people have begun to work hard to figure out how to get at the things we need in as humane and environmentally sound ways as possible, and we've got to keep up that effort. But, however dirty it is, it does not begin to compare in volume and danger to the thing that we have now that we're trying to replace. If you want to see what a lot of mining looks like, go look at coal fields spread across the planet. And the reason there's so many of them is because when you mine lithium and cobalt, you can go and put it in a battery or a solar panel, and there it sits for the next 25 years doing its job, which is to catch the energy of the sun as it rises every day. When you mine coal, what do? You set it on fire, and then you have to go mine some more of it the next day. And that's what we've been doing for 100 years. Not only that, when you burn that coal or other fossil fuel, you put stuff in the air that kills people directly. Big new meta-studies over the last 2 years have put good numbers on this. 9 million humans a year die. That's 1 death in 5 on this planet from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. If you've been to Shanghai or Delhi in recent years, this won't completely surprise you, but it happens here too. There are hundreds of thousands of cases of childhood asthma in this country that are linked directly to what people are breathing, and we know who gets to breathe it because we know who gets to live next to highways and near refineries and on and on and on. So whatever damage is being done in this, it is much smaller than the damage we are doing every day now and take for granted because we've done it every day of our lives. Just to put an image on it that'll help you get a sense of the volume. 40% of all ship traffic on planet Earth is devoted entirely to the project of carrying coal and oil and gas back and forth around the planet to be burned. We do not need them. You hear arguments like windmills will kill birds, or solar farms in the desert will endanger tortoises, or offshore wind installations may harm whales. There's sometimes truth to these, but again, the question is compared to what? Because the things that we're doing now are, windmills do kill a few birds, way less than cats, buildings, or fossil fuel installations of all kinds. But the real point is that the way that we're now heating the planet is going to drive, we think, 1/3 or 1/2 of bird species extinct before the century is over. That's not localized damage, that's the most gross and enormous damage that one could think of. If you were a whale, you might worry a little bit about the offshore wind turbine that had been put there, but you would worry a lot more about the fact that the ocean is soaking up 93% of the excess heat we're producing and getting warmer than we've ever seen it before. There were buoys in the Gulf of Mexico this summer where they recorded ocean water temperatures of 101.8 degrees, which is the same as the temperature in a hot tub, okay? And these are the highest temperatures ever recorded in the ocean. We're going to wipe out, even if we do everything right from this point, the scientists think we're going to wipe out 90 or 95% of the world's coral reefs. We're already killing them at extraordinary rates. I don't mean to get over-exercised here. I was writing this week in the newsletter I write sometimes about the fact that 2 weeks ago there was a big fire in a parking garage in an airport in the UK. And before the fire was even out, there were people all over Twitter, and you can guess what kind of people insisting that this must be coming from electric vehicles catching on fire, how dangerous they were, and so on. Well, as it turns out, this is the internet age and there's a cell phone everywhere, and someone had a picture of the vehicle that had started the fire, and what do you know, it was a diesel Range Rover. But just the whole point was like that people would look at that and think, oh, it must be this EV, instead of the fact that we all have gotten used to the idea that we drive around every day in a machine with 15 gallons of highly flammable liquid between our legs, you know? The number of car fires with EVs is about 1/20th the number with combustion vehicles. I think all arguments like that are essentially or often cover for a deeper argument, which is, I don't want to see things change. Whatever it is, it's probably a good idea, but I don't really want it near me in the place that I love, or the place that I've grown used to looking at and admiring. And I understand that argument because we've asked people, as the environmental movement has grown, to make connection with place, and connection with place is important and powerful. Sticking up for one's backyard is a useful thing. To a point, because we have to weigh that value against all the other places that are being destroyed, and against the fact that eventually even the place that you love will be destroyed if we do not get this under control and fast. It's similar, if somewhat more pointed, than the situation with housing. I'm not an expert in here, although my earliest work as an organizer was around homelessness in New York City when I lived there as a young person, back in the days when we thought homelessness was a kind of novel, new thing that we were going to take care of, instead of what we've allowed it to become, which is a kind of permanent feature of urban life in the richest country in the world. It is a huge crisis, affordable housing around this country. We all know that. And we also know that building good housing for people can play an enormous role in the environmental question too, because as we build that housing, we're able to build it in ways that are helpful both for the environment and for the people who are going to live in them, so that they don't have to keep paying huge amounts of money for their energy over and over and over again. But too often, I think people just think, put it somewhere else, not next to me. Or they think, and I think, since we encounter this a lot in my state, in Vermont, I sometimes propose that our new state motto should be, do anything you want once I die. We're figuring out some remarkable ways to, I'm an occasional Methodist Sunday school teacher, so I will say it in those terms. We're figuring out some remarkable ways to sin. We are destroying the creation around us. We're running Genesis in reverse. We are decreating the planet in our time. And for those who have heard at some point in their lives that we were supposed to love our neighbors, the idea that we leave millions of them unhoused or in poor housing, or worried constantly that they're about to be evicted from whatever housing they've managed to find, is a sin and a shame. I could talk about that for a long time. I'm pretty good at guilt. But I actually don't want to do that tonight, because I want to the thing that's been exciting me here is trying to posit the other idea, trying to figure out ways to make it seem not just necessary, mandatory, moral, but quite exciting to imagine quickly building this new world. We haven't changed that much in our world in my lifetime. It still looks physically, the only thing we've really changed is that we now spend all day staring at the palm of our hands. But other than that, but we need now to change very quickly, and that could be exciting. Imagine a world powered by the sun. A world where we break the 700,000-year-old human habit of combustion, of setting things on fire. It served us well. Darwin said that language and combustion were the two things that really set humans apart, but now it's causing us enormous problems. And now we don't need it anymore because there is a large ball of burning gas 93 million miles away that we know how to make use of. It's incredible to think about that, to imagine leveraging the power of this orb that we have been staring at ever since we gained consciousness. Not just staring at, worshiping. What's on your flag here in New Mexico? You know, I had a wonderful hour-long interlude today where two young friends took me up your Sun Mountain in the middle of town to sort of stare out across the beauty of the Jemez and the Sandia and over into the Pecos Wilderness and on and on and on. But there we were on Sun Mountain, and the sun was illuminating it all. And if we leaned on that power, then what would we not need to lean on? We would not need to lean on the power of the Koch brothers, who are our biggest oil and gas barons and used their winnings to degrade and deform our democracy. We wouldn't need to lean on Vladimir Putin, Europe's biggest merchant of hydrocarbons, who used his winnings to launch a land war in Europe in the 21st century. We wouldn't need to lean on the king of Saudi Arabia. There's sun and wind everywhere. It's part of our, and to think about the kind of beauty of, you know, a world where instead of toiling to dig up rocks from beneath the earth that we then laboriously refine and set on fire and harness, instead just sit back and bask in the glow of the sun and let it power our lives. There's something very beautiful from, I told you I was a Methodist, energy from heaven, not from hell, you know? And similarly, there are deep and powerful moral reasons why we should be building enough housing for people. But let's just imagine for a moment the beauty of neighborhoods that are really diverse and interesting, where you're not surrounded, we don't just sort everybody by how much money they have and then set them living exactly next to each other wherever, but a place that's of the kind where humans spent most of their lives living, that were far more diverse, where people of all kinds interacted easily. A kind of place, for instance, that was diverse and dense enough that old people like me could imagine perhaps aging in place there. And being able to have people to rely on once we couldn't drive easily or something like that. It's nice to have these retirement communities we have now for people who can afford them, I guess. But really, most people, I think, would rather be surrounded by people of every age and kind at all times. It's a beautiful vision and not that hard to do. It's not impossible to imagine infilling a place like Santa Fe so that there were more diverse neighborhoods and possibilities, and then you'd be left with something quite beautiful. So maybe don't be the person who hires a lawyer and tries to get in the way of a different kind of future. Maybe be the person who embraces these kind of possibilities. Maybe be the person, even if you're going to have to pay the tax, who says, you know what, I could probably afford 3%, you know. Maybe I'm not going to join with the local realtors and try to block something that's obviously a good idea in a country as grotesquely divided by wealth and income as ours is, for instance. All right. End of sermon. I'm going to show you pictures for a minute as your reward for listening to this. Because we're in the Art Institute, and I want to just talk for a minute about art, because 350.org is organized, we think, about 20,000 demonstrations in every country on earth except North Korea. And one of the things we realized very early on was that we wanted them to be beautiful so that they would connect, so that they would make messages, sometimes very explicitly, like this art project, but often just in other ways. So I'm just going to, let's see if I show you just some from the early days of people figuring out around the world how to do things, often with their bodies, to kind of draw attention. That's a carbon footprint. That's, hundreds of school children in the snow in Colorado, I think. And we have 20,000 of these, so I could show them to you all night, and I won't, but they mean a lot to me, at any rate. They were markers along the way of people's cleverness and creativity and bravery that people brought, you know. We couldn't do these kind of demonstrations now in China, but even 15 years ago, they were hard. And people had to, I mean, some of them ended up getting arrested. People were also just witty in figuring out how to make the point. That's the Student Government Association of the Maldives pointing out the existential problem of living a couple of meters above sea level on a rapidly warming planet, you know. This, I've been looking at a lot this week. I organized this in 2009. We were doing this day of action, and I was in the Middle East. It was very difficult even then, but we had a little meeting in Bethlehem, and there were too many military barriers in the way to do it all in the same place. But the Jordanians said, we'll make a big 3 on our beach, and the Palestinians said, we'll do the 5, and the Israelis said, we'll make the 0 in Tel Aviv, and we got airplanes up to kind of, and it was all over the news in the Middle East for a week because it was one of those rare examples of people putting aside the kind of traumas that we see right now in order to focus on something else that united and not divided. You know, sometime that's golf carts. Place in California, just a reminder that we need everybody engaged in this work. These are from that big art project day. That's on Brighton Beach, and that's in the beach in Santo Domingo, and that's in Egypt, Iceland. But here I'm going to show you a project I was talking about with the Red Fellows here a little earlier. We did this big march in New York with 400,000 people in 2015, but while we were doing that, our colleagues in the South Pacific did this amazing art project, really, where they built a canoe like that one on each of those islands, Vanuatu, the Marshalls, the Solomons, that are going to go underwater probably this century. But their slogan is, we're not drowning, we're fighting. And they built them, and they took them to Newcastle in Australia, which is the biggest coal port in the world, and for a day used them to block the biggest warships in the world from leaving the port. And when we started seeing images like this come in, I was struck. I'm a writer. I think that there are a certain number of just tropes embedded in the human psyche. And one of them is about the fight between the small and the many against the mighty and the few. And when we can figure out ways to kind of get that through visually, artistically, it's really powerful. But now I'm spending my time, because most of the work I've done over the years has been with young people, because they've done most of the work on climate change. And they are magnificent from all over the world, and they have really brought it and done it. But now, I heard one too many people say to me, it's up to the next generation to solve these problems, which seems ignoble, and it also seems impractical, because for all their intelligence and idealism and energy, young people lack the structural power to make change on the scale we need in the time that we have by themselves. So we've tried to conjure up a movement in the last 2 years of people who do have structural power. I've taken to saying that if you have hair coming out of your ears, you have structural power coming out of your ears, okay? There are 70 million of us over the age of 60 in this country. We punch above our weight because we all vote. There's no known way to stop old people from voting. And we ended up with most of the assets. We got about 70% of the country's finance. If you want to take on Wall Street or Washington or your local government here or whatever it is, it's good to have some people with hairlines like mine backing up those kids. And the Third Act has been doing that all along, and we've been doing it a lot with art from the beginning. Some of it's this sort of beautiful and art of the kind that you would expect. And some of it's just, this is the year our great slug of fossils against fossil fuels early on. And we've been having a great time. Our biggest event so far in our 2-year history was this March, where we organized simultaneously 100 demonstrations in 100 cities against the biggest banks in the world. Citi, Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, that are the biggest funders of the fossil fuel industry. And there was lots and lots of art. Much credit due to my wonderful colleague David Solnit, brother of the great essayist Rebecca Solnit, who's the best practitioner of this kind of there he is, teaching people how to make banners and signs. So we had beautiful art builds that got everybody engaged, and they're beautiful imagery of all kinds, cutting up credit cards and so on, and figuring out how to do art so you could get people's grandkids onto banners. And it's art in the street, art wherever. These demonstrations were fantastic. I was at the one in Washington, D.C., where we did what I think is best described as real performance art. We sat in outside these banks and closed them down for the day. But we've reached the age where sprawling on the sidewalk for 3 or 4 hours is less fun than it might once have been. And so what we did was went around to the Goodwill all over the Washington area and got hundreds of rocking chairs. And that's what we closed down the banks with. And it was the most comfortable sit-in I've ever done. And it got, the New York Times the next day was all about the rocking chair rebellion that was underway across this country. So I know that y'all are all still in the first blush of ruddy youth here. So tell your grandparents about this work that we are up to and encourage them to join us. I'll just end by saying, in relation to all this work, I do not know if we can win these fights. The powers that be that we're up against are enormously strong. In the case of climate change, above all, the fossil fuel industry, which is terrified of the fact that the sun will deliver your power for free. To them, that's the stupidest business model ever invented, and they've done everything they can for 40 years to make sure that we do not change. And in the case of housing, just our built-in set of very strong ideas about things like property values and so on and so forth that make it hard for us to change, even when at some level we know not only that we should, but that kind of we want to too. That we want to see shifts coming. So I don't know if we will win, because these are time tests. If we don't win fast on climate, we don't win. Dr. King used to end talks by saying, quoting from the Massachusetts abolitionist Theodore Parker, he'd say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, which meant, I think, this may take a while, but we're going to win, which was a comforting thought for very brave people. We don't have that particular comfort because the arc of the physical universe is short and it bends toward heat. And so our time to act is right now. And if for some reason you've been keeping your powder dry, this is the moment. I can't guarantee you're going to win, but I've shown you enough pictures to let you know that if you're in these fights, that you have lots and lots of brothers and sisters around the planet with whom to try and do what we can. So thank you all very much. That's my 93-year-old mother.
That's very loud. Can we turn this mic down a little bit? Or just hold it further away. It definitely felt like I was in church there for a minute. That's good. So when we first read your article in Mother Jones, why progressives need to learn to love the green building boom, I think it just felt like this just critical piece about what seems really obvious, I think, to us in affordable housing, which is that affordable housing is also sustainable. It uses less resources in construction and also in the heating and cooling of buildings. And yet it felt so fresh, like no one was talking about that idea in that way, especially not with a platform like yours. And what I understand about your newest book, which you say is the closest thing to a memoir, one of the two kind of formative events of your childhood is when your town basically stops an affordable housing development project. And I'm making some assumptions here, but probably at least partially on the basis of wanting to keep out lower income folks and people of color and preserve a sense of safety. I would love for you to just draw that connection out of it and to be more on the nose, like how do you see the history of exclusionary zoning contributing to the climate crisis?
Sure. And
how do we move away from that?
This most recent book is kind of a little bit of memoir of 1970, growing up in this 1970s in this suburban Boston, in this case, in the town of Lexington. And there were two events that opened the book. One that I knew about then, and that was very optimistic and powerful. The Vietnam Veterans Against the War, then led by a young, lanky, charismatic, recently platoon Lieutenant John Kerry, who, come to think of it, I talked to on the phone earlier today because he's now our climate envoy around the world. He led a group of people who wanted to bivouac on the green in part of a protest, and the town fathers, and they were all fathers in those days, said they couldn't, and so 500 townspeople showed up to go to jail with them, including my father. Still the biggest civil disobedience action in Massachusetts history. So it was a really good moment. And to me, I think as a young kid, 10 or 11, I not only was impressed by my father, who was a mild-mannered business reporter. This was a one-off, out-of-character thing, but made a deep impression. I was also impressed by just the thought that this was the direction the world was going in, that we were moving towards, that the group project of making America better, that it started with FDR and the New Deal and continued through the Great Society and things, with lots of contention and things, was nonetheless working. I mean, this was the moment when we just had the first Earth Day, and now we were getting them within 18 months. Think of that, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and all that. That was good. At the same time, in this town, there was a referendum to allow the first affordable housing development, 100 units of multifamily housing, because multifamily housing is what you have to have if you want to have affordable housing. Everybody cannot going to have their own backyard and their own driveway, which is what everybody in Lexington had. And everybody in town who was important spoke out in favor of it. All the preachers and everybody else. But in the center of the voting booth, people in town voted it down 2-1. And so it stayed for the next 50 years. Not out of overt racism, the town was not that in this case, but out of deep concerns about things like property values. And the 1970s, I think, was the decade when we decided that we were going to wind down that group project of making America better and wind up the project of a kind of hyper-individualist, markets will solve our problems, we'll just look out for ourselves, Reaganite America, which is what we've more or less lived with ever since. I think it was a decisive turn, but I think it had huge implications in many ways. One of them was the fact that this racial wealth gap existed then, meant that in a town like Lexington, black people didn't have the money to buy in to, because they've been excluded from the GI Bill, because Social Security exempted domestic workers and farm workers at the beginning because of all the ongoing, and hence missed out on this extraordinary elevator of escalating property values that account for. And that's why that racial wealth gap is larger now in this country than it was in 1970. That's the biggest single contributor to it. But it's also the thing, that hyper-individualism, we all need a big house thing. That explains the single biggest slug of carbon that went into the atmosphere. The second biggest was the industrialization of China, which at least had the virtue of drawing 600 or 700 million people out of poverty. In this case, the biggest slug was just the American project of building bigger houses farther apart from each other, which just necessitated huge, huge expenditures of energy to heat, cool, and move between these things. So, I think these things are deeply intertwined, and that, as is often the case, disentangling them requires working on a number of fronts at once.
It feels like the environmental movement is in a really interesting moment. And as you mentioned earlier, you are a writer in your day job and have done so much to illuminate these issues as a writer, but then kind of, it sounds like realized at some point, oh, information alone is not going to get the job done. We also need to really build a movement here. And 350.org and so many other groups have done an incredible job of pushing the kind of political pressure that has resulted in the Inflation Reduction Act. And now we have money and the power of leveraging the private market in addition to the funds in the Inflation Reduction Act. And yet, as you mentioned, it's also a moment of, I guess, the kind of ideas or the ethos of some of the environmental movement coming up against what it means to do the next thing, which is actually like really roll your sleeves up and get in there and build solar and build housing. And yet, your vision is so inspiring to me. Like, I imagine on the ground, like, wow, what if we had people who came in support of affordable housing projects because they were environmentalists and because they see and know that that connection is critical. So we're not there yet. How do we get there, and what changes in thinking and values do you think we need, particularly coming out of the environmental movement?
The environmental movement has, I once spent an intense but happy year editing this huge doorstop of an anthology for the Library of America on environmental writing since Thoreau across America. And so I've thought a lot about environmentalism in America for a long time meant preservation of as much of certain parts of the status quo, usually the parts that weren't useful for producing huge economic returns, so rocks, ice, great vistas, things like that. And that was important work. And I stood up there today on top of Sun Mountain looking at the Pecos Wilderness and thinking good thoughts about John Muir and all the, Bob Marshall and all the people who, made that happen. But now it has to be about other things too. Because to the extent that we value the beauty of and the stability of the planet that we had the good fortune to be born onto, it's going to require dealing with change, not holding on quite as tight to things. That doesn't mean that you go cut down old growth wilderness to put up solar panels. We've got lots of other land we can do that on, But it does mean that we're going to have to do it on some land, and we're going to have to find ourselves. I think among other things, it requires a certain amount of aesthetic shift. Looking at a windmill spinning on the horizon and thinking, that's kind of beautiful. That's the breeze made visible, That's, those aesthetic shifts are not automatic or easy, but they're the kind of things that we can bring ourselves to do, I think. And it's one of the reasons, among other things, why art is so important to this process. Environmentalists have been pretty good at appealing to the whichever hemisphere of the brain it is that likes bar graphs and pie charts and things, but less good at appealing to a more, and so because I think I've said this once or twice, I think, you can posit the idea, I think correctly, that climate change in particular may be a kind of final exam for whether or not the big brain was a useful adaptation or not. The real question, I imagine, will come down to the size of the hearts connected to those brains. And that's that's why, at this point, the scientists and the engineers have done a huge amount of their work, and now it's artists and theologians and sociologists and all the rest of us who have an extraordinary amount of work to do now, I think. And I would just add, it would have been a hell of a lot easier if we'd done that work starting when we first knew about this. It's a hard job to do over 40 years, but not an impossible one. It may be an impossible one to do over 6. The reason we didn't was A, because we're creatures of inertia, and B, because the fossil fuel industry mounted a fierce campaign of utter lying to keep us from doing what we needed to do. And so now we desperately have our work cut out for us.
I loved hearing and seeing your images of Third Act tonight. I think it's such a relevant idea for Santa Fe. Obviously, Santa Fe is beautiful. It's a town that attracts a lot of people when they want to retire. We've also lost a lot of young people and people in the middle of their lives because it's really unaffordable to live here. It's hard to buy a home. It's hard to raise a family. So our median age is really a lot higher than a lot of other places. And Santa Fe also is a city with, particularly lately, some pretty intensely public land use battles. And to be frank, it's often older residents who are organizing to oppose higher density infill projects. And almost to a T, they'll often say things like, I love affordable housing, but can't you do it somewhere else? Like, just not here. This place is really special. And I don't want it to change, one of Wendell Berry's favorite lines to me is, what the young ask of the old is to hope. I think that really resonates with me, because I think especially in a time of such climate crisis, we really do need that. But I think it's also that younger generations, which only in Santa Fe would I be considered part of a younger generation, but I'm claiming it. Younger generations also need older generations to care. And to care really deeply about what comes after they're gone, to care about as much about the plight of others, whether that's a person struggling to find affordable housing or the future generations and their chances of a habitable planet, as they care for their own sense of comfort and well-being.
Yeah.
And I think, to be very frank, this is an issue very personal to me because I feel this abandonment often of elders here. And I think as a white person, I feel that a lot less than younger people of color. And so I wonder, how do we heal this generational divide, and what advice can you give those folks that are afraid to really live their values?
It's a really good question, and it's really at the heart of the work we're doing around the Third Act. Nobody had tried to organize older people in progressive ways for a long time, because the assumption among political scientists and others has been that people become more conservative as they age. And there's something to that. You have something to protect, whatever. But I think it's much less true for older people at the moment, perhaps, than in the past. If you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s now, it's important to remember that your first act was in this moment of remarkable social, cultural, political transformation in this society. The moment when we started taking women seriously in public life, the apex of the first civil rights movement. The first Earth Day, when there were, in 1970, 20 million Americans in the street, 10% of the then population, the biggest demonstration in American history. Think about getting 10% of Santa Fe out, in the street. That would be enough to, get noticed by the powers that be. So it's true that in our second act, we were encouraged, and we often, with millions of notable exceptions and things, often settled into a sort of place where consumerism was as important as citizenship, and maybe more so. But that's water under the bridge, and people now emerge in their third act with time, with skills acquired over a lifetime and connections, maybe with some resources, but also with a strong sense of, ever stronger sense of legacy, which is a very abstract word until you're closer to the exit than the entrance, at which point it seems to me to become a little more pointed. You start thinking about the world that you're going to be leaving behind. And at the moment, we're going to be the first generation that leaves behind a world that's way worse than the one that we found, And that's not a thing that people, when they think about it, want. So I have not been surprised that people have been flooding into this work we're doing in Third Act. We're setting up chapters in state after state after state. We're doing these big, and one of the things that we're discovering is just how much pleasure people take working with young people, That's the thing, one of the things that we've focused hardest on from the very beginning. We do a lot of stuff in collaboration, and that collaboration turns out to be remarkably easy. Much more than I'd expected. A lot of the kind of okay boomer, sort of whatever thing. But it turns out that actually the relationship between people the age of grandparents and grandchildren is pretty easy, at least compared to the relationship between people of the age of parents and children. All grandparents love their grandchildren completely unconditionally, no matter what craziness they're up to. And most grandchildren are wise enough to cut their grandparents some slack, that they will not cut their parents. And so it's really been fun to be doing this work back and forth across the generations. And as people do more of it, I think they get less defensive, less in the kind of crouch. Remember, we have one of the most important communications systems in our country, Fox News, whose entire business model is scare old people 24 hours a day. That's their entire, if you have any doubt, watch what all the ads are for. They're all for like step-in bathtubs or things, okay? That's their, and so it's no wonder that people are like, oh, I'm scared to go to the big city because somebody will do some crime on me or whatever it is. When people break out of that and are doing this kind of stuff, it really, things open up fast and easy. I gotta say, I love working with my fellow older people. When I walk in a room and see a lot of gray hair now, I just say, hell yes. We're capable of causing immense amounts of good trouble, and I think we will. So.
Last question. We are very indebted to you and your generational allies who have really kept hope alive. So thank you. Last question before we turn to audience questions. After dinner last night, I have to admit, I had a little bit of trouble sleeping because I was like, okay, 6 years, starting now, we gotta get going. Should I be sleeping? What are the 3 things we have to do at the national level in the next 6 years, and the 3 things you think we have to do in New Mexico in the next 6 years to win?
I mean, look, the first thing we have to do at the national level, we're sort of doing right now. The Inflation Reduction Act is deeply imperfect, filled with lots of dumb gifts to the fossil fuel industry and on, but it is providing enough money to start getting this. So job one is to make sure, and this is not the only reason for this, but to make completely goddamn sure that Donald Trump does not get elected president. Shut down every piece of good work in an instant. Joe Biden is not perfect. There's lots of things that I disagree with that he's done, on and on, but we do not have, in a binary system like the one we live in, we do not have our vote is, it's not, I think my friend Rebecca Solnit said it at one point, a vote is not a Valentine, it's a choice that you have to make on constructive grounds. We need to do a lot of reforming of permitting laws and things to allow things to go more quickly, but part of that means that there has to be real opportunities for serious consensus building in the process. It has to happen fast, but it will happen faster if we try and do it right instead of just ramming things down through, on people. But my appeal is, as I was saying tonight, is more actually aimed at those of us who might decide to intervene in things. If people back off some, then there's a chance for getting the real and important concerns aired and dealt with and moved on. The third thing that has to happen at the national level is the shutdown, a set of things to start radically shutting down the fossil fuel industry, because the physics just does not support our ability to pour more carbon into the atmosphere. I think the most important place to do this right now is with this. The U.S. in the last 5 or 6 years has built this export machine for oil and gas, and the scale of it is truly amazing. If you counted the carbon emissions from all the stuff that we're exporting now against our own totals, then America would not have reduced its greenhouse gas emissions one bit since 2005. So getting a handle on that is crucial. That'll be difficult in places like New Mexico, where so much of revenue comes from oil and gas. And I think right now is the time to be planning in Santa Fe for how to make a transition to a renewable energy economy. Happily, you're blessed with, I think one way to say it is you're cursed with a lot of oil and gas under the soil. I'm exquisitely happy to be from Vermont, where there's nothing of value under the soil at all, even. And so we've never had it as a crutch to lean on. But you're blessed with an extraordinary amount of sun and wind, and figuring out how to use those for your own purposes, but then you don't need it all. You can export some of that power off to places where there's more people too, and pay off some of the carbon debt that those places accumulated over the years. So, and I think close to home, just the things we're talking about, trying to work fast to do the things around energy and around housing, which really are the two deepest crises I think that we face, to do the things that, honest to God, anybody who actually stops and thinks about it for a while knows that we have to do. And so now our job is just to do it, to have a period of time when we recapture some of that American vigor for getting things done, instead of the kind of lawyerly. Sometimes people ask me, here's a way of saying this, sometimes young people ask me, what profession, what should I do, what career should I go into to help the climate most? And I usually tell them, do whatever you're good at, because your skills will be useful there, and we need you as citizens too, whatever. But now more and more what I tell people, and people ask that, I say, you know what you should do? You should be an electrician. We need a lot of electricians. Electricians get paid well, and for good reason, and they do an extraordinary service. That's who's, carpenters, the people who are going to build those houses and wire those houses, the people who are going to wire those solar panels, the people who are going to make that happen. We spent, I think, too long telling young people that the best thing in the world to be was a lawyer or something like that, that was what was prestigious, and I think it's time to think about some other things, probably.
Thank you. Veronica.
Yes, we have time for 2 questions from the audience. Solar is unattainable for me now because I need significant roof repairs. How should I think about doing my part when I can't reduce my own footprint?
So this is a very good question, and I'm so glad whoever asked it managed to master this Baroque system that you have put in place for, look, if there was one thing I could get across, it would be this. It really is a good idea. It's great if you can afford to do it, to put solar on your house. We got to build the IRA, makes it more affordable, and we all should be working on that. But the American default on all things is to the individual. The climate's changing. What car should I drive? I'm happy that I have a roof covered with solar panels and that they're connected to an EV in the garage and on and on. But I don't try to fool myself that that's how we're going to solve this. We are way past the point where climate change is going to get solved 1 Tesla at a time. So the most important thing an individual can do is be less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to rewrite the basic political and economic ground rules here. That's why we formed 350. That's why we 350 Santa Fe chapter does great work, and I'm sure there'll soon be 3rd Act chapter here, and on and on and on. power has some chance of bending those, because I mean, just as you're going back home tonight, just look at the sheer number of cars and stores, and it's very hard to imagine in the short time that we have making all those changes one by one. They're going to have to become as the result of a series of laws and economic incentives and things that allow people en masse to make that switch very quickly. And that's not an individual process, I think.
We fund so much important work like our education system in our state with oil and gas monies. It feels ingrained. How can we make progress on transitioning?
Well, that's that's the thing I was sort of talking a little bit about before, and it's very, very hard. The only thing I can tell you is start now. Get a head start on it, because we don't live on a planet that's going to, it may not happen in time, but it is going to happen in the relatively near future that we stop burning oil and gas in large quantities. And there's two reasons for that. One is that solar and wind is cheaper, and that will eventually undercut the export market for all of this. And the other is that the world is burning up, and sooner or later, probably, more gradually than we'd like, but with real impact, the countries of the world are going to decide that we can't keep doing this. And so that's not a long-term plan for the future. You're going to be doing it the next few years, because change doesn't happen immediately. So over that 3 or 4 years, be setting aside some of that money, do the kind of things that a few societies in this world managed to do. Norway took their oil and gas money and set it aside in a big trust fund, and the interest off that pays for Norway. Alaska, our most socialist state by far, don't tell them, does exactly the same thing. They have a big permanent fund that oil and gas revenues have gone into, and it funds the state, and they write a check to everybody in the state every year. So it's going to take creativity. The one thing you can't do is just depend on that going forward, or else you'll just fall off a cliff at some point.
Thank you so much, Bill McKibben, for joining us.
I've gotten to see the artwork in some of these studios back here, and it's really wonderful, so don't miss the opportunity.
So before we go, I just wanted to close the evening out by acknowledging the fellows that are in the room with us tonight who have gone through a 6-month process with us. They've attended 16 different workshops, including all of these talks, and are actively working on improving affordable housing and making Santa Fe more sustainable. So could we ask all the fellows to please stand up? I'd really like to volunteer. I'd like to invite one of our fellows, Melanie Kirby, up just for a second, because she wants to share just a little bit more about this biggest initiative that they're working on right now, which is the excise tax.
Wow, everything I thought I was going to say is now totally transformed after hearing what Bill has been talking about, because it connects so directly. And I want to share a couple of things with you, which is one, we have a mutual friend, Kirk Webster, who I've known for years. Kirk is a professional beekeeper in Vermont, and I myself am a professional beekeeper. Kirk's been out to my farm.
Hold the mic up a little more.
Yes, sure. And with that comes my story. I'm actually a native New Mexican from southern New Mexico. I actually came up here for school and went to St. John's in the 90s. At that time, and I'm pretty surprised to hear, though, the change, we referred to Sun Mountain as Monte Sol and Monte Luna. And so I share that with you because it really is a story about a sense of place. And all of us are seeking this sense of place, this sense of home, but also this sense of community. And the cultures that have been here prior to the movement of more coming in, have really helped to establish this place as one that is accepting and that is sharing, but also that recognizes the importance of what we call reciprocity and giving back. I myself struggle with finding housing. I've moved 3 times in 3 years. Once I started to work in Santa Fe, my farm is actually an hour and a half north, and that's too far to commute because I also work in Santa Fe. And so how is it that I can help to feed people by sharing my bees, but not actually be able to afford a home for my family? And so my story is probably unique in comparison to others, because not everybody here works with bees every day, but it is actually quite similar to many others who have come here, who have been allured by this beautiful majesty and by these cultures that have been here, but not able to actually stay and live here, even though we're doing good work that we love and that we enjoy and that we want to be able to continue to provide for our communities. So I would really like to encourage everybody to consider voting for the excise tax. It will not affect sellers, it only affects buyers. And for those buyers who are wanting to come here, who are also captivated by the majesty that we have here, to recognize the fact that the cultures that have been here before really do also need a place to be able to stay to live here, because that's what's going to keep this community going. And it's our way of giving back with each other. So please keep that in
mind. Thank you so much. This officially concludes our livability series. Thank you for everyone joining us on this journey, and thank you to Mike, our boss, who's always willing to entertain crazy ideas, get behind them, and then really embed kind of that new learning and that new passion into our work. So we love it.